Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Tenshu General. This is a casual real-time strategy game, really more like a board game, honestly, by SmartArt Game Studio that was released on December 1st of 2015, so it's pretty recent. Now, to be honest with you, I didn't even know this thing existed until the developers actually sent me an email, and they're like, hey, would you like to take a look at our game? So they actually ended up sending me a copy to take a look at, and I'm sorry it took me so long to actually get a video up on it. But oddly enough, I had a few issues getting this thing to work properly. I'm not entirely sure what was wrong. It could have just been that my Java version was out of date, because it seems like it runs in Java. But regardless, it just seems to have sorted itself out, and now it actually works just fine for the most part. Java's not exactly my first choice for game development, let's put it that way. But issues aside, let's go ahead and talk about what this game is and what I think about it. Now, presentation-wise, it's certainly not much to look at. It's a 2D game. It's done in this top-down map perspective where there's barely any detail in the maps themselves. And you basically just have a bunch of dotted lines showing the unit paths that can go along. And you have some very simple artwork to denote the Tenshu, which is your castle, basically, as well as the villages, what kind of terrain you've got, your armies, which are just flags, and you have advisors. There's not really anything in the way of animations. They just kind of slide along the map, sort of like you would see in a board game kind of environment. And generally speaking, there's not really too much to look at other than just what exactly is going on. Luckily, the game doesn't really need particularly great visuals, so what it has suffices, and that is perfectly fine for this type of game. Like I said, it plays out more like a board game than it does a real-time strategy game, and more detailed visuals wouldn't really help the thing out in the long run. It's pretty sparse on the sound design as well. There's basically only one tune that it plays, and it's a fairly traditional sounding Japanese-inspired tune, so it works out in the game's favor. But the sound effects, what very few of them there are, aren't really to write home about, and there's no voice acting to speak of, so obviously you don't really need to worry about either of those things. This is really a kind of bare-bones game as far as its presentation goes. So what they did was focus on making a nice clean interface that is very easy to work with, and they made sure to just kind of trim the fat. There's no real extraneous things going on with this game in terms of its visuals or its sound design. And while that certainly means it's not impressive to look at or listen to, it also means that there's nothing really getting in your way in terms of visuals or sound design, so that kind of works out in the game's favor, in some ways anyway. But what they really focused on here is ironing out the gameplay, which is very, very simple. You start with one or more provinces, and these contain various icons to let you fiddle around with things. The first of these is only in your capital province, so to speak. You pick one at the beginning of each match, and it will determine where your starting location is for where you can produce armies and such. And that is where your Tenshu is located, your castle. Now, clicking on the castle icon allows you to do one of three things. You can either train an advisor, who you can only get one of at a time, but they will increase production in a given province. You can produce walls, which will make it harder to attack the particular castle. Or you can field an army. You can have up to 4 armies at any given time. Each army, when you select its icon, has 3 units available. You either have cavalry, infantry, or archers. And you can get a maximum of 4 of each of these in a given army. When you max it all the way out, you have a full-strength army of 12 units. And really that's what's going to determine whether or not you win a battle, is how many units you have in the army and of what type they are. Because terrain will give different advantages to different kinds of units. For example, mountains are advantageous to archers, but they are disadvantageous toward infantry. So archers get a bonus on mountainous terrain provinces, and infantry get a debuff on it. There are also 2 other kinds of terrain that each favor a different kind of unit and also give disadvantages to another kind of unit. Terrain will also give an advantage to one particular farm improvement over others, but I'll get to that in a moment. The actual battle system is very simple and straightforward. You simply click and drag your army into an adjacent province. If it's a province you own, you can actually send it all the way through your provinces and just get to whatever other province you want to go to. If you don't own the province, if it's either an enemy province or a rebel province, which is a neutral one, then you have to go directly into the adjacent province that is neutral or enemy and capture that before you can continue on to the next province. pretty straightforward. When you actually get into a fight with an enemy army, whether that be an actual enemy army or a rebel army, then it goes into an auto-calc fight, and basically whoever has the bigger army wins. There is a better chance of winning a fight if you cater to that particular terrain's advantages and disadvantages. For example, if you're in mountainous terrain and you have a full stack of archers, then you stand a bit of a better chance than somebody who has a full stack of infantry, for example. And when it gets to both full-size armies, at least in my experience, they generally just wipe each other out completely, instead of just one side winning over the other. Sometimes you will actually win a fight, but your army will retreat, or sometimes you will lose a fight, but your army will not be completely destroyed, and you'll be able to retreat and rebuild that army. Otherwise, you're going to have to field a new one, and each new army costs you 400 rice just for the army itself, and of course it starts with a single unit, so it's basically worthless unless you're just capturing neutral territory. Luckily, you can buy new units for that army wherever you want, basically. I mean, as long as it's in friendly territory, you can buy units for it. The cavalry cost 500, while the infantry cost 400, and archers cost 300 rice, respectively. And you will be losing these units a lot, so you will want to get your rice production up as quickly as possible. This is done through villages, some of which only have 1 slot for upgrades, some of which have up to 4 slots for upgrades. And basically the idea there is that you have these various upgrades that you can perform to actually make it produce more rice. You can put additional farms on it, each of which costs you 100 rice, or you can buy tools for it, which will cost you 50 apiece. Or you can do irrigation, which is 100 apiece, or buy oxen for it, which is 200 apiece. Each of these provides more production bonuses, and depending on the terrain that is in that particular province, some are going to be more effective than others. For example, in mountainous terrain, you have a bonus to irrigation, whereas in forest terrain, you have bonuses to tools. So you're going to want to play to those strengths and weaknesses, although you don't really get any weaknesses with villages other than just the sheer size of them. Some of these provinces only have 1 village in them, and they are only 1 slot of upgrades. Some of them have multiple villages, each of which might be different size, so you can actually get different bonuses from them. And some provinces don't have any villages at all in them, and they're just there for you to pass through or basically hold a choke point or something like that. Now, the rice itself is generated on a timer. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a meter that fills up with rice bags, and when it fills up all the way, it goes into your supply of rice that you can actually spend on things. But there's also another way you can get rice, and that's by capturing territories that have villages in them and are currently owned by enemies, in which case you will just take whatever the villages had in them at the time, which usually isn't that much unless they've really built up production in that particular village. So this is really a game more about building your army up and then just going out and capturing as much territory as you possibly can and holding as much territory as you possibly can in order to build up more resources to produce more armies at full strength so you can go and just wipe out the enemy. Because if you try to take a Tenshu with even a full-sized army, your army is going to get decimated, basically, because they upgrade their Tenshu as soon as they possibly can, and thus you end up with ridiculously tough-to-beat Tenshu. And it takes multiple full-strength armies to be able to defeat a Tenshu. So generally speaking, you're going to want 4 armies as soon as you possibly can, and that requires you to build up production as soon as possible, which in turn requires you to capture as much territory as soon as possible and hold it as long as possible. So what usually ended up happening in my case is I would capture a bunch of territory and then set up my armies on the border of my territory so I could build up my forces and thus go out and conquer as much as I possibly could. This is a lot easier when you have a couple of choke point territories that prevent the enemy from getting into your territory and just conquering whatever they want willy-nilly. Unfortunately, that also means that they're going to hammer those territories as much as they possibly can, which in turn means that you're going to have a lot of resource waste by just rebuilding your army as a defensive line over and over and over again, which in turn can stagnate your economy and thus the enemy will overwhelm you. So really the game's more about finding that equilibrium between attacking and defending that will make sure that your economy never stagnates and that the enemy never gains too much territory. to be able to field full armies and then just completely wipe the floor with you. Which doesn't really happen all that much as long as you're playing a 3-player or more game, in which case they will often fight amongst themselves and leave you sitting there building up your defenses and building up your armies and such like that while they go back and forth on the conquering front. In other words, the AI is not exactly the best in this game. It's decent enough that sometimes it gives you a challenge, but generally speaking, it tends to make a lot of really dumb decisions and just throw a lot of units at things for no discernible reason, while often leaving some of their own territories completely undefended. Now you might think, oh, they leave their territories open, then you should just easily be able to attack them. Well, yes and no. On the one hand, you can attack their territories. On the other hand, it takes friggin' forever for any of your armies to move. Which also in turn means that if you send your army off to attack a territory and thus leave your own territory wide open to attack, the replacement army you decided to move in to defend the territory may not be there by the time the enemy army gets there and just captures it, so then you have to capture it back, which in turn creates a really annoying cycle of just constantly recapturing your own territories over and over and over again. You have to keep in mind that you are limited to 4 armies, so holding a large swath of territory without any choke points at all is pretty much impossible. So you really need to hold the key territories that you want and not worry as much about the other ones, which in turn gets kind of annoying seeing the enemy just waltz right through all that territory that used to be yours and now it's theirs, and now you get to spend the next few minutes capturing it all back from them. But that's really all the game is, a constant back and forth of capturing and recapturing territory over and over and over again until you finally manage to defeat all the enemy by capturing their Tenshu. And as simple as the interactions are, it feels like you're playing a board game more than you're playing a strategy game. But there are 2 glaring problems with this thing. The first of which being, it's single player only. There is no multiplayer of any kind. And that severely limits its replayability considering that you only have 4 campaigns in the single player, which aren't that varied. Occasionally you have an objective that is not simply capture the enemy Tenshu, but not all that often, and the skirmish mode is just basic capture the enemy Tenshu gameplay on a fairly small variety of maps. So that does wear thin pretty quickly, and I think multiplayer would definitely help in that regard if they could even get it in there. The other glaring problem I have with it is the pacing. The way it plays out, it feels like it would just work better as a turn-based game. The timer for resource production isn't exactly fast, and the armies themselves move very, very slowly, so I can't help but wonder what this thing would play like if they had made it a turn-based game. That would admittedly make it a lot more like a board game, which is what it kind of feels like anyway, so it would kind of fit better, I think. Though admittedly this is really more speculation just based on how the game feels when you play it. It's at least a question well worth asking the developers whether they thought about it or not. But of course they would have to restructure the game quite a bit for it to really work properly in turn-based mode as well, so who knows on that. But overall, I feel like this is more of a time waster kind of game than a game you would play for hours and hours and hours. It's a very, very simplistic game, and if you're a strategy game fan, then you likely play far more complex games than this, and you would go into this thing and find it lacking. If you're more of a casual player, you might be able to get more out of it simply because it is very simple, it's very easy to pick up and play, but then you run into the problem of the game becoming very samey very quickly, and there's not really much strategic depth to it at all. So this is very much a your mileage may vary kind of game. The game's ultimately just too simple and shallow for me to really get much out of it as a longtime strategy game fan. But to be fair, I'm not really the target audience for this kind of game. And if you are the target audience of this kind of game, you might be able to get something out of it. It's currently $6 US on Steam, so it's a pretty cheap game if you do want to pick it up and try it out for yourself. And I will of course have a link in the video description box where you can pick it up if you're interested. Just don't go into it expecting much more than really a board game when you get down to it, and you might be able to enjoy it. Thanks for watching.